house on the mine, and it was watching. The house sat on the map like a tiny mistake, a box of weathered boards pinned to the edge of an old silica mine. I inherited the place because my aunt had nothing else to leave, and because the town meant little to me anymore. I came to temper research with solitude, to listen to rock instead of other people. The first night I slept inside, the windows reflected moonlight in a way that made them look like eyes. I told myself the feeling of being looked at was nothing but fatigue and imagination. The town's long winters leaking into my thoughts. Morning brought better logic, measurements, soil samples, a checklist. The mine had been sealed decades ago. Maps blueprinted a tidy cone of collapse. I set up a small workbench and found my aunt's spiral-bound ledger wedged beneath a floorboard. Its margins were filled with dates, and short notes disturbed dust, strange sounds. But the handwriting grew steadier and smaller toward the final pages. I made coffee and read until the light slanted, every annotation a needle that pricked my calm. When I looked up, the house seemed to have shifted on its beams, just a fraction, as if to look back. At midday, a sound threaded the tasks, a low click, like a hinge settling, then nothing. I chalked it up to age, to boards learning the weather. Yet objects rearranged themselves in ways that invited interpretation. The binoculars hanging from a peg found on the railing. The oil lamp moved a full foot from its original place. Each change was small, domestically plausible, but together they formed a choreography that implied attention. I walked the perimeter of the house and found footprints in the dust leading around the shaft, wide and shallow, as though something had balanced on the rim and weighed a thought. Night thickened the doubt. The pocket watch my aunt had insisted I keep stopped at 22 minutes past 8 every evening. It was an old brass thing. When it worked, it ticked with a polite insistence. When the watch stopped, the house's windows seemed to deepen into dark pits, refusing the interior light. I tried to record the phenomenon, setting a camera to record the porch. Reviewing footage in the black hours, I found nothing supernatural, only shifts in shadow, the ordinary swing of lamplight. Yet each clip ended with the same inexplicable smear across the glass, like an eye pressed from the inside. I began to keep the ledger on my lap, turning to the densest pages for comfort. The previous owner wrote rational notes, weather changes and minor repairs, then shifted to terse warnings. Do not leave light on full. Do not whistle. Note the times it opens. The handwriting slants grew more cramped at the margins, where she had pressed the pen hard. One entry read, "It watches between minutes and memory, where the house thinks it's alone." I laughed aloud then, a small, brittle sound that startled me more than the words did. Yet, when the house settled after that laugh, the sound replied with a slow creak from the floor beneath my feet. The mine rim was too inviting to ignore. The opening was a black throat, its sides smoothed by moisture and a kind of patient polishing. At day, I peered down with a torch, and beyond the first ledge, the light swallowed itself. The rock below had a gloss like an old photograph, and when my light struck an angle, it returned a tiny glare that could have been mistaken for reflection or something intent. I felt watched from beneath, not by a face in shadow, but by a density that listened. My rational mind filled the void with labels: settlement, echo chamber. Yet, the ledger's repeated timestamps suggested something else. Sarah, a neighbor who kept a watchful distance, called once for coffee and stayed to listen instead of speak. She told me small things: how lights in the house sometimes blinked when the mind gave a sigh, how animals avoided the rim at dusk, how her father once refused to build anything facing that pit. She did not believe in hauntings, she said, only in attention beyond our ability to name. We walked to the shaft together, and she set her hand on the porch rail. "It likes you noticing," she said flatly, "and it doesn't like being ignored." Her hand trembled while she said it, as if the notion had put pressure on a bruise. Over nights, the pattern clarified. Objects nudged toward the shaft, as if drawn by gravity. Clocks faltered at nearly the same minute, and the house's windows brightened opposite the pit, like pupils narrowing. I began leaving small tests, notes on the step, an upside-down mug, scratches on soft wood, and always found them altered in discreet ways by morning. Nothing was ever broken, only repositioned, as if the house were cataloging my attempts. Sometimes I imagined tiny corridors of air, carrying purposeful currents from the mine up through the sill and into the living room, tapping each object like a clerk announcing a visitor. One evening I took binoculars and sat on the porch until the sun threw down the last temperate band of light. Looking across the rim, I hoped to see movement, a figure, a light, anything to pin the sensation to cause. Instead, the binoculars gathered nothing, but a quiet so granular it felt deliberate. The surface of the mine glinted like a pupil when it caught the last sun. At some point, a sound came, not a voice, but a sequence of small shocks, rhythmic enough to suggest counting. My skin prickled in recognition. It was counting down the minutes until something else would happen. I tried to stay rational, set timers, filmed, left the lamp burning. The lamp's flame would waver despite the absence of wind, and the camera captured frames of ordinary rooms, punctuated by a faint smudge crawling across glass-like condensation, formed into intention. The pocket watch stopped exactly when the counting began and resumed when it ended, as if the time itself were being sampled and measured. When the counting paused, the house inhaled, a deep, slow settling, and objects returned to the places I had left them, almost apologetically. It was as if acknowledgement gave the house a satisfaction it couldn't find otherwise. The ledger's last pages bore a small map, a crude ink ring drawn around a notch in the shaft. A line led to a word my aunt had emphasized beneath a flourish: pupil. Beneath that a note: when it looks back, you must look away. The instruction felt ridiculous and vital all at once. I argued with it for 2 nights, poking and prodding the rule with experiments, not out of courage, but stubbornness. On the 3rd night, while the pocket watch stopped and the counting started, I peered down with my torch instead of turning my head away. The light returned to shape, a perfect circular gloss that didn't reflect, but matched my torch's beam with a calm equivalence. The shape below didn't move, but it rearranged how my thoughts sat in my skull. It wasn't a creature, but a surface aligned to receive attention. The sensation of being observed changed. It was not simply external, but reciprocal. When I lowered the torch, the house brightened in a slow, synchronized way, windows catching and concentrating the remaining light into lines. When I looked back, the pupil sharpened. I felt a stitch of memory that wasn't mine. Laughing in the dark, a hand covering a mouth, the hush that follows a sudden secret. The house seemed to keep those stitches as trophies. I began to dream in brackets of time. In the dream, the house's windows blinked like someone reading, and the mine answered with a tapping that matched the rhythm of my pulse. Waking, my hands would find the same tiny changes I'd noticed before sleep: an extra footprint, a ridge smoothed on the railing, a page in the ledger turned. I stopped opening the curtains at night because the act of unveiling felt like a dare. Yet the need to see, to confirm, to record, pulled at me with the force of a tide. Curiosity was at once compass and anchor, leading me closer and refusing retreat. The counting altered one night. Instead of a steady descent, it paused, then resumed in an irregular staccato that matched the rhythm of a child's game I couldn't place. I felt a pressure in the room, like a cooled hand passed along the back of my neck, and the house tilted slightly, boards groaning not from age, but from intention. I remembered my aunt's last line in the ledger: "You can look, but do not invite reply." The admonition arrived too late. I had already replied merely by being present, and the house began an answering language of small arrangements. A chair turned half facing the mine, the curtains splayed like a hand, letting light through. In the last days, I tested myself the way a diver tests air. I left the porch light on and went down to the rim with nothing but a small torch. The world below was a blackness that smelled faintly of cool mineral and old rain. I stood at the edge and felt the counting at once. It filled the space between heartbeats and stretched into a patience I could not match. I wanted to see a face, a shape, a mechanism, but the mind refused those gratifications. Instead, it offered me a surface tuned to attention, a mirror that learned to watch without eyes. And in that watching, it kept no hostility, only a measured curiosity, older than the house itself. I left eventually, not in panic, but with resigned carefulness. Before I closed the door, I set the ledger on the center table and wrote a single line: "It was watching." I left the lamp lit and the binoculars hung from the peg. As I drove away, the house held its posture like a thing that had expected an exit and catalogued it. The town's outlines slid behind me, and every mile felt like a wager I had yet to lose. Sometimes, at odd hours when I sat in other rooms and tried to forget, my phone would beep with a tiny image, one frame from the porch camera, showing the window smear sharpened into a circle that seemed to regard the lens with patient clarity. Whether the house acted alone, the mind was patient, or my mind had found a story to fit its anxieties, I cannot say. Sometimes the watching felt comforting, as if acknowledgement bridged emptiness. Sometimes it felt like being catalogued by something that had all the time in the world. The ledger remained in my drawers after I moved. I read it at odd hours until its admonitions knitted themselves into my sleep. The final image, that impassive, polished pupil, returns to me like a tide mark. I think of looking, then of looking away, and I wonder which action increases the house's attention and which relieves it. The last fragment is less a conclusion than a shape pressed onto memory. Once, while flipping through the ledger, I found a margin note in different handwriting that read, "If it stares, keep your eyes lower." The page beneath was blank for several inches, as if the pen had floated and then stopped. I keep that instruction because rules are better than panic. At night, I sometimes picture the windows like watchful faces and imagine the mind polishing itself, counting notes like a melody. The story doesn't end in violence or deliverance. It waits, patient as rock. It was watching then, and given the ledger and my own stubborn presence, I suspect it's still watching now.